You don't like the precedent here?
No, absolutely not. I mean, the FAA has an incredibly rigorous process for certifying aircraft, and that system has worked incredibly well to the point where if you look over the last 10 years in commercial aviation, we've had one fatality. Now, name another form of transportation that can boast that type of safety record. And so now we have a situation where, due to political pressure and probably some lack of training, we've had 2 crashes. And now Boeing has to, the FAA has to burden that effort and try and figure out how do we get back to where we started from.
What do you mean political pressure?
Well, I think Boeing or FAA was facing a lot of pressure when a lot of their partners, civil aviation authorities around the world, which used to be that work in conjunction with the FAA very well, started grounding this aircraft based on really little data at all. And I think the president probably made the right decision politically by saying, you know, we only have a couple of these aircraft in this country. Why not just ground them over, you know, an overabundance of caution? However, that's not why you should ground an aircraft. You should ground an aircraft.
Just to be clear, I just want to push back a bit because this is not what we're getting from the FAA at all. We spoke yesterday with Daniel Elwell. He said no global pressure, no political pressure. What changed for us was we got some new definitive evidence, data from the ground, data from refined satellites that showed these paths were similar. Until then, they didn't have the data. So they don't know the motivations for, I asked him about the motivations for some of the other global governments that were grounding these planes. He said, we don't know their motivations, but we didn't have the data until yesterday.
Well, I think they've had the data on the elevations since the time of the crash. That has been publicly available from a variety of sources. I'm not really sure what kind of evidence they pulled out of the hole in the ground in Ethiopia, but I think Dan was just in a tough position where the president went out before him, made the call, and then I think the FAA was kind of asked to justify the decision.
Do you think Paris will treat the black boxes any differently than D.C. would?
I hope not. I really hope not. But they are professionals over there. I think they will do the best they can to get the data off of these things. It is a very delicate task of pulling this data off because you really only get one shot at it. And if you mess it up, that data is lost forever.
Why is that?
Just because of the technical difficulties in pulling the information off. There's only a little bit of software out there that's available, and I think it's, you know, you're basically working with bent up floppy disk or whatever they have in there. It's just a difficult challenge.
The Financial Times today tries to make, I don't know, so you might call it a leap, but they do argue that the United States has run afoul of the global community on things like climate change, 5G, intelligence, diplomacy, and that it's finally come home to roost in aviation security. And that's why 40 countries grounded before we had the nerve to. What do you make of that?
I think that's a ridiculous statement. You know, it'll be a little while before we have all the data pulled off those black boxes. But I think what you're going to find is that it's going to be, as with all crashes, it's going to be a combination of pilot error, inexperience with the aircraft, and perhaps some software issues with the aircraft itself. Boeing was working. Go ahead.
I understand your point, but the number of fatalities for a new model at this stage is higher with this model than almost any model going back to the 60s.
No,
all those models had to deal with new pilots getting used to the equipment.
Yeah, I would agree with that, but I would also counter with every pilot that flies a 737 goes through a series of trainings. Basically, they are put in a simulator and they are facing 5 different scenarios that can end in catastrophic failure. The loss of trim, basically the control of the tail, is one of those scenarios. And so every pilot has been trained on this several times, and they need to keep that training continuing. If you go look at some of the foreign carriers, perhaps in Ethiopia, perhaps in Indonesia, that's expensive to do that training. So who knows when the last time these pilots had that type of training.
So with all of that in mind, Scott, how can you speculate how long this grounding might last for Boeing?
You know, that's a great question, simply because for one, it'll be a little while before we know what's on those black boxes. Two, Boeing is working on the software fix where the system that points the nose down when it thinks it's going to stall, they're going to institute a new software that involves more sensors on the aircraft rather than just the one that everybody's been talking about. And so, the Boeing people are probably arguing, this plane is safe today. We'll do some extra fixes to make it even safer. But it'll be an interesting dynamic to see how soon they can get these planes back up in the air, because 50,000 people a day are now not flying because they have to make reservations, have been rerouted, flights have been canceled. So obviously this is a big decision for Boeing and the FAA, because I think in their hearts the FAA engineers believe that this aircraft is safe, or they wouldn't have certified it in the first place.
One of the Wall Street analysts that covers the company estimates today 3 to 6 months to fix and get certification. Does that sound about right?
I think that's probably fair. I think that's fair. I mean, Boeing and the FAA have been working on this since the first crash, trying to figure out exactly what happened. I think the Indonesian authorities were very forthright when they gave their report on what they thought happened to the aircraft, and they basically pinned it on a maintenance failure. So I think they know what the problem was, and that's why the Boeing folks were saying, okay, if that sensor fails, let's also include other sensors, because we know we're not going to have multiple failures. So 3 to 6 months. I think it's probably going to be faster than that, but it's going to be a political decision more than an engineering decision.
Scott, there's a sidebar story being written today about the sort of explosion of Chinese regulation and aviation, how China passed the U.S. all the way back in 2005 as the largest market for delivery of new commercial jets, and basically has never looked back. And the decision early by Chinese regulators to ground these planes is actually a notable development. Do you see this as a U.S. versus China sort of story in the next few years about the claim for global regulation of aircraft?
I hope not. The Chinese obviously do have a lot of support from their government, which enables them to get into markets where they may not be competitive, and so the subsidies from the Chinese government allows them to be competitive. But if the world over continues to look at the FAA as the gold standard for safety regulations, we have obviously the safest aviation system in the world. We have foreign governments, civil aviation authorities coming into this country all the time for training to learn how the FAA does things. And so I'm not concerned immediately, but yeah, I think that's probably a potential threat.